The luxury cruise ship was supposed to be a peaceful getaway for Jason, a retired Marine looking to escape the chaos of everyday life. But when a group of rowdy bikers began harassing passengers and throwing their weight around, Jason decided to stay out of it. At first, that changed when the gang crossed the line, targeting an elderly couple who couldn't defend themselves. What the bikers didn't know was that Jason had spent years mastering the art of combat, and he wasn't about to back down. The sun was setting as Jason stepped aboard the massive cruise ship, the golden light reflecting off the polished railings. It was a rare moment of peace in his otherwise disciplined life. A retired Marine, Jason had spent years in high-pressure environments, from deserts to jungles, always ready for the next mission. But now, he just wanted a break, a chance to unwind and enjoy a week at sea. Dressed simply in cargo pants and a faded shirt, Jason carried himself with quiet confidence. His sharp eyes scanned the bustling crowd of passengers as they boarded, but his demeanor was relaxed. He wasn't here to assess threats or lead a mission. He was here for calm seas, good food, and maybe a few well-earned naps. The ship's interior was luxurious, with gleaming floors and chandeliers sparkling overhead. Families hurried to their cabins, couples posed for photos, and the staff moved seamlessly through the crowd, welcoming everyone with practiced smiles. Jason couldn't help but appreciate the precision of it all. It reminded him of the efficiency he'd once demanded from his team. He found his cabin on the mid-deck, a modest room with a window offering a stunning view of the ocean. Tossing his duffel bag onto the bed, he decided to explore the ship before dinner. As he stepped out into the corridor, the sound of laughter and chatter drifted toward him. It was the kind of noise that signaled normalcy, something Jason hadn't experienced in years. At the pool deck, Jason grabbed a beer and leaned against the railing, taking in the horizon. That's when he noticed them, a group of burly, leather-clad men lounging at a corner table. They were loud, drawing attention to themselves with raucous laughter and crude jokes. The patches on their vests bore names like Iron Serpents and Vince the Hammer. Jason observed them casually, his instincts kicking in. The bikers weren't doing anything overtly threatening, but their behavior was disruptive enough to make a few passengers uneasy. One of them had already snatched a drink from a passing waiter, downing it without so much as a thank you. Another flicked a cigarette into the pool, earning glares from nearby families. Jason shook his head and looked away. This wasn't his business. He wasn't a Marine on duty anymore, just a guy on vacation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jason headed to the main dining area. The scent of roasted meats and freshly baked bread filled the air, and the room buzzed with excitement as passengers settled into their tables. Jason found a seat near the back, enjoying the relative quiet. "Mind if we join you?" a soft voice asked. Jason looked up to see an elderly couple smiling at him. The man wore a crisp button-up shirt and suspenders, while the woman's floral dress swayed slightly as she waited for his response. "Not at all," Jason said, gesturing to the seats. "I'm George, and this is my wife, Eileen," the man said as they sat. "First cruise?" Jason replied with a small smile. "Needed a break." Eileen chuckled. "You picked a good one. Nothing like the open ocean to clear your head." The three chatted through dinner, Jason finding their warmth and humor refreshing. He learned that the Wilsons were celebrating their 50th anniversary, and this cruise was their dream trip. They asked him about his life, and while he didn't share much detail about his time in the Marines, he appreciated their genuine interest. But as the night wore on, Jason noticed the bikers entering the dining room, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere. They didn't sit at a table but lingered near the bar, loud and rowdy. One of them, a stocky man with a shaved head, made a comment to a passing waitress that earned him a glare. Jason's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to focus on his conversation with the Wilsons. This wasn't his fight. The next morning, Jason found himself drawn to the ship's upper deck, where the pool sparkled under the early sunlight. The sounds of laughter and splashing children mixed with the murmur of adults sipping coffee or reading by the loungers. It was the peaceful start to the day that Jason had hoped for when he booked this trip. He grabbed a cup of black coffee from the cafe and leaned against the railing, watching the horizon. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax, his mind clear. But the serenity didn't last long. The bikers were back. They swaggered onto the deck as if they owned it, their leather vests and boots starkly out of place among the pastel-colored swimsuits and casual summer attire of the other passengers. Vince, the gang's leader, strode ahead, his shaved head gleaming in the sun. His men followed closely, their laughter loud and their gestures exaggerated. Jason observed from a distance, his instincts flaring as he sipped his coffee. The bikers weren't just rowdy, they were looking for an audience. Vince lit a cigar, exhaling a plume of smoke that drifted over a group of sunbathers, prompting annoyed glances. One of the bikers cannonballed into the pool, soaking nearby families. Instead of apologizing, he laughed and high-fived his buddies, who jeered at the irritated parents. Jason frowned. This wasn't just harmless fun, it was intimidation. The bikers were testing boundaries, seeing how far they could push before anyone pushed back. He could tell from their demeanor that they thrived on control, and right now, they were winning. As Jason returned his empty coffee cup to a nearby table, he caught the attention of Vince, who had just finished his cigar. The gang leader's sharp eyes locked onto Jason, sizing him up. With a smirk, Vince sauntered over, his boots thudding against the deck. "Morning, tough guy," Vince drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "You look like you've seen a thing or two." Jason's expression didn't waver. "Just here to enjoy the view." Vince chuckled, gesturing to his men. "You hear that, boys? He's here to enjoy the view." The gang laughed on cue, their voices carrying across the deck. Passengers began to glance nervously in Jason's direction, clearly hoping to avoid becoming involved in whatever was brewing. Jason met Vince's gaze without flinching. "Anything I can help you with?" Vince leaned in slightly, his smirk widening. "Nah, just curious. You've got that look about you, like you think you're better than us." Jason took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. "I don't think anything about you." The tension crackled between them, Vince's smirk faltering for a moment before returning. "We'll see about that," he said, backing away with a lazy shrug. "Enjoy your coffee, tough guy." The encounter ended without incident, but Jason knew this was far from over. Vince had made it clear that he viewed Jason as a challenge, and the gang wasn't likely to let it slide. Jason returned to his cabin, his relaxed demeanor hiding the alertness that now gripped him. As he walked down the corridor, he passed the Wilsons, who greeted him with warm smiles. "Lovely day, isn't it?" Eileen said, her cheerful tone a stark contrast to Jason's inner tension. "Sure is," Jason replied, forcing a small smile. "You two doing all right?" "Couldn't be better," George said. "We're heading to the ballroom tonight. Care to join us?" Jason hesitated. The idea of sitting through a formal evening didn't appeal to him, but he didn't want to disappoint the kind couple. "Enjoy yourselves." As the Wilsons continued down the hall, Jason watched them go, his mind already returning to the bikers. He didn't want trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him, and if Vince and his gang pushed too far, Jason knew he'd have no choice but to push back. The ballroom glittered with soft golden light that evening, the polished floors reflecting the elegance of the guests swirling across the room. Jason hadn't intended to join the formal gathering, but something had nagged at him after his earlier encounter with Vince. He found himself sitting near the back, nursing a glass of water, his sharp eyes scanning the room. The Wilsons were easy to spot. George and Eileen glided across the dance floor with surprising grace for their age, their faces lit with joy. It was a reminder of why Jason had come on this cruise in the first place, to see moments like this, untouched by the chaos of the world. But the moment didn't last. The bikers entered the ballroom like a storm crashing a quiet beach. Vince led the way, his leather vest and heavy boots a sharp contrast to the tuxedos and evening gowns around him. The gang's loud laughter and exaggerated movements drew immediate attention, silencing the soft music as they pushed through the crowd. Jason tensed, his hand tightening around his glass. He could see the discomfort ripple through the room as passengers tried to avoid eye contact with the bikers. A waiter approached the group, offering a polite smile and an attempt at hospitality, but Vince shoved him aside with a dismissive wave. Jason's eyes narrowed as he followed their movements. The gang's antics weren't random. Vince was scanning the room, looking for a target. It didn't take long. Vince's gaze landed on the Wilsons, still dancing in the center of the floor. A sly grin spread across his face as he gestured to his men, whispering something that made them chuckle. They began moving toward the couple, weaving through the crowd like wolves stalking prey. Jason stood, his movements measured but deliberate. He closed the distance between himself and the bikers, positioning himself just a few steps from the Wilsons. Vince noticed him immediately, his grin widening as if he'd been expecting this. "Evening, tough guy," Vince drawled, his voice loud enough to carry across the room. "Didn't think this was your kind of scene." Jason ignored the taunt, his focus on the Wilsons. George and Eileen had stopped dancing, their expressions a mix of confusion and unease. Jason stepped closer to them, his presence a quiet shield. "Something I can help you with?" Jason asked Vince, his tone calm but firm. Vince chuckled, spreading his arms theatrically. "Nah, we were just admiring this lovely couple. Ain't that right, boys?" The gang laughed on cue, the sound grating and insincere. Jason's jaw tightened. He glanced at the Wilsons and said quietly, "Why don't you two head back to your table? I'll handle this." George hesitated, but Eileen gently tugged his arm. "Come on, dear," she whispered, her voice trembling. They moved away, casting worried glances over their shoulders. With the Wilsons safely out of the way, Jason turned his full attention to Vince. The room had grown eerily quiet, the other guests watching with bated breath. Jason stepped closer, his posture relaxed, but his presence commanding. "You've made your point," Jason said evenly. "Now leave them alone." Vince's grin faded, replaced by a spark of anger. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of his gang. "You think you can tell me what to do?" he sneered, stepping closer. "I'm not telling you," Jason replied. "I'm giving you a chance to walk away." The room seemed to hold its breath as the tension between them crackled like a live wire. Vince's hand twitched, as if he were considering making a move, but something in Jason's calm, unyielding gaze gave him pause. After a long moment, Vince scoffed and took a step back. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood." He turned to his gang, jerking his head toward the door. "Let's get out of here." The bikers followed him out, their bravado intact but their confidence shaken. Jason stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the door until they were gone. Only then did he relax, letting out a quiet breath. The room slowly came back to life, the murmurs of the guests growing louder as the tension ebbed away. Jason returned to his seat, his expression unreadable. He didn't want this to escalate, but he knew Vince wasn't the type to let things go. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, Jason woke to the faint sound of knocking on his cabin door. Groggy but alert, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, his instincts telling him something wasn't right. As he opened the door, he was greeted by a pale and visibly shaken Eileen Wilson. She said, her voice trembling, "It's our cabin. Someone broke in." Jason's face hardened. "Are you both all right?" Eileen nodded quickly. "We weren't there when it happened, thank God. They left something. Please come." Jason followed Eileen down the corridor to her cabin, where George stood just inside the doorway, his face pale. The door frame had deep scratches, evidence of someone forcing their way in. Inside, the room was in disarray. Drawers overturned, clothes scattered across the floor. But what caught Jason's attention was the crude message scrawled across the mirror in red lipstick. "Stay out of it." Jason's jaw tightened as he stepped into the room, scanning every detail. The message was meant for him, a clear warning from Vince and his gang. It wasn't just a scare tactic, it was a challenge. George gestured toward the mess, his voice filled with frustration. "We told security, but they said there's no proof of who did it. Can you believe that? They said it's probably just a prank." Jason frowned. He'd dealt with enough bureaucracy in his military days to know when people didn't want to get involved, but this wasn't a prank. It was a threat. As Jason reassured the Wilsons, his mind worked quickly, forming a plan. He couldn't rely on ship security to handle this, not when the bikers clearly had no fear of consequences. Vince had crossed a line and Jason knew there was no backing down now. "I'll take care of this," Jason said firmly. "Stay in the public areas for now. Don't go anywhere alone." Eileen's eyes widened. "Jason, you're not going to confront them, are you?" "They're dangerous." Jason gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Don't worry about me. Just focus on staying safe." After leaving the Wilsons, Jason began his investigation. He started by observing the bikers from a distance, keeping his movements subtle. Vince and his gang had resumed their antics, acting as if nothing had happened. They laughed loudly, shoved each other around, and made crude remarks to passing passengers. Jason's instincts told him there was more to their presence on the ship than just harassment. These men weren't ordinary vacationers. They were organized, their actions deliberate. Jason decided to dig deeper. Late that afternoon, he followed two of the bikers to an off-limits section of the ship near the storage decks. Careful to remain unseen, Jason watched as they unlocked a storage room and disappeared inside. When they emerged a few minutes later, they were carrying a duffel bag that looked suspiciously heavy. Jason's suspicions deepened. Whatever was in that bag wasn't for personal use. It was contraband. That evening, Jason confronted Vince directly. He found the gang leader and a few of his men at one of the ship's bars, holding court as they intimidated the bartender into serving them free drinks. Jason walked up to Vince, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside him. "We need to talk," Jason said, his voice low but firm. Vince turned, his eyes narrowing. "Well? If it isn't the hero, what do you want, tough guy?" Jason stepped closer, his voice deadly calm. "You went after the Wilsons. That was your first mistake. Don't make another." Vince smirked, leaning back in his chair. "You gonna tattle on us to security? They won't do a damn thing." Jason's gaze didn't waver. "I don't need security." The air around them seemed to crackle with tension. Vince's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly covered it with a laugh. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you don't scare me, Marine." Jason's eyes narrowed. "You should be scared of what happens when you push the wrong man too far." As Jason walked away, Vince's laughter followed him, but it lacked the confidence it had before. Jason knew this wasn't over, but he also knew he'd rattled the gang leader. Vince was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. He'd think twice before making his next move. Back in his cabin, Jason began preparing for the inevitable confrontation. He wasn't just protecting the Wilsons anymore. He was taking a stand. Vince and his gang thought they could intimidate and control everyone on the ship, but they'd made a critical mistake. They'd underestimated him. Jason spent the rest of the evening piecing together what he'd seen and overheard. The bikers weren't just causing trouble for sport. They were running a smuggling operation right under everyone's noses. The duffel bags, the off-limit storage area, and their brazen confidence all pointed to something larger. Whatever they were transporting, it was significant enough to make them reckless. The ship's security, while polite, had been dismissive of the Wilsons' complaint. Jason realized he'd need to take matters into his own hands, not just to protect the Wilsons, but to stop the bikers from using the cruise as their personal playground. The stakes had grown higher. Early the next morning, Jason put his plan into motion. First, he revisited the storage deck, careful to avoid being seen. He found the door the bikers had used the day before and examined it closely. The lock was standard, but Jason's military training had taught him to think on his feet. Using a small toolkit he always carried, he picked the lock in under a minute. Inside, the room was dimly lit and cramped, lined with crates and shelves. Jason spotted the duffel bags almost immediately. Unzipping one, he found stacks of neatly wrapped packages. Drugs, judging by the labels and markings. Another bag contained weapons, including small handguns and knives, carefully concealed beneath layers of clothing. Jason's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a smuggling ring. It was a full-scale operation. The bikers were using the cruise as a cover to transport illegal goods to their contact at the next port. Jason snapped a few photos of the evidence with his phone, ensuring he had proof if things escalated. Then he carefully resealed the bags and locked the door behind him. His next step was to set a trap, one that would expose the bikers' activities while keeping the Wilsons and the other passengers safe. He approached a crew member he'd noticed earlier, a young, nervous-looking man who seemed eager to help. Jason introduced himself and subtly hinted at what he'd discovered. "You don't need to get involved directly," Jason assured him. "Just pass this along to the captain. Tell him there's evidence in the storage room near the engine deck. He'll know what to do." The crew member hesitated but eventually nodded. He said quietly, "Are you sure this is safe?" Jason gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Just stick to the plan. I'll handle the rest." By midday, Jason had positioned himself near the storage deck, waiting for the bikers to make their next move. Sure enough, Vince and two of his men arrived, their movements casual but purposeful. Jason watched from the shadows as they entered the storage room, emerging minutes later with the same duffel bags he'd seen before. As they walked toward the upper decks, Jason followed at a safe distance. The bikers were heading for one of the ship's less frequented lounges, likely to meet with a contact or stash the goods elsewhere. Jason's heart pounded, not with fear, but with the sharp focus of a man who had spent years in high-stakes situations. In the lounge, Jason slipped into a corner booth, watching as Vince and his men settled at a table near the back. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting around the room. Jason couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told him they were on edge. The moment came when Vince stood and reached into his jacket, pulling out a small envelope. He handed it to one of his men, who tucked it into a duffel bag. Jason guessed it was some kind of payment or instruction. Before Jason could act, the crew member he'd spoken to earlier entered the lounge, his face pale but determined. He locked eyes with Jason and gave a subtle nod. Jason returned the gesture, signaling that it was time. Moments later, ship security arrived, led by the captain himself. "Gentlemen," the captain said, his voice firm but calm. "We need to have a word." Vince's smirk returned, though Jason could see the tension in his shoulders. "What's this about?" Vince asked, feigning ignorance. The captain gestured to the duffel bags. "Those need to be inspected." Vince's smirk faltered. "You got no right to go through my stuff," he snapped. "Actually," the captain replied, "this is private property, and I'm responsible for the safety of everyone on board. Either cooperate, or I'll have you confined to your quarters until we reach the next port." Jason stood quietly, observing the exchange. Vince glanced around the room, his mind clearly racing. He knew that if the bags were opened, the operation would be exposed. But before security could intervene, Vince made a sudden move, grabbing one of the bags and bolting for the exit. Jason didn't hesitate. He intercepted Vince in a single, fluid motion, blocking the gang leader's path and grabbing the bag. "Going somewhere?" Jason asked, his voice calm but firm. Vince growled, his eyes blazing with anger. "You've got no idea who you're messing with." Jason leaned in, his gaze steely. "Neither do you." With Jason's help, Security apprehended Vince and his men, confiscating the bags and escorting them to the brig. As the room cleared, the captain approached Jason, his expression a mix of gratitude and admiration. "You handled that better than most of my team would have," the captain said. Jason nodded, just doing what needed to be done. But as Jason walked away, he knew this wasn't over. Vince wasn't the type to take defeat lightly, and Jason had just made himself the gang's primary target. Jason didn't need to be told that Vince and his gang would retaliate. It was only a matter of when. He'd humiliated them in front of the captain and ship security, dismantling their operation in the process. Men like Vince didn't forgive, and they certainly didn't forget. That night, Jason kept a low profile. He avoided the main lounges and stayed in public areas where he could keep an eye on the Wilsons, who were nervously enjoying the evening's entertainment. Jason had assured them they were safe, but the nagging feeling in his gut told him otherwise. The confrontation came earlier than he expected. As Jason stepped onto an outdoor deck for some fresh air, the cool sea breeze brushing against his skin, he caught the sound of muffled footsteps behind him. He glanced at the reflection in a nearby window and saw 3 of Vince's men closing in, their faces dark with intent. Jason turned, his posture relaxed, though his muscles were coiled like a spring. "Evening, gentlemen," he said evenly, taking a walk. The tallest of the 3, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, sneered. "You think you're funny, Marine? Vince doesn't like people sticking their noses where they don't belong." Jason took a step forward, his gaze locked on the man's. "And I don't like bullies. Guess we're at an impasse." The men spread out, trying to flank him. Jason's mind raced through his options. The deck was isolated, with only the sound of waves and the hum of the ship filling the silence. He couldn't rely on anyone else to step in. This was on him. The first man lunged, aiming for Jason's midsection. With fluid precision, Jason sidestepped the attack, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. A sharp cry of pain escaped the man's lips as Jason used his momentum to send him sprawling onto the deck. The second attacker came next, swinging a lead pipe he'd pulled from under his jacket. Jason ducked, the pipe whistling past his head, and delivered a sharp elbow to the man's ribs. The attacker staggered, winded but still on his feet. The third man tried to catch Jason off guard, rushing him from behind, but Jason was ready. He spun and delivered a swift kick to the man's chest, sending him crashing into the railing. The man gasped for air, clutching his chest as he slumped to the floor. Within moments, 2 of the bikers were incapacitated, groaning in pain, while the third stumbled to his feet, his eyes wide with fear. "You're gonna regret this," he spat, backing away. Jason stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with authority. "If you're smart, you'll tell Vince to back off. This ends now." The man hesitated, his bravado crumbling under Jason's unyielding stare. He nodded quickly, grabbing his wounded companions and helping them to their feet. Together they retreated, limping back into the ship's interior. Jason watched them go, his pulse steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He knew this skirmish was just the beginning. Vince wouldn't let this slide, but Jason had sent a clear message. He wasn't an easy target. Later that evening, Jason returned to the Wilsons' cabin to check on them. George answered the door, his expression one of relief and worry. "Are you all right? We heard some commotion earlier," Jason reassured him. "Just a misunderstanding with a few passengers. How are you 2 holding up?" Eileen appeared behind George, her face pale but determined. "We're all right. Thanks to you. This isn't over, is it?" Jason shook his head. "Probably not. But you're safe. I'll make sure of that." George placed a hand on Jason's shoulder. "You've done more for us than we could ever repay." Jason offered a small smile. "No need for thanks. Just stay alert and stick to crowded areas. I'll handle the rest." As Jason returned to his own cabin, his thoughts turned to Vince. The gang leader had been humiliated, his operation exposed, and his men beaten. Jason knew men like Vince didn't take defeat lightly. The next move wouldn't be a simple ambush. It would be calculated, and it would target more than just Jason. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring out the small window at the endless expanse of ocean. The fight wasn't over, but Jason was ready. Years of training and experience had taught him one thing above all else. No matter how high the stakes, he would never back down. The following morning, the air aboard the ship was heavy with unease. Jason could feel it as he moved through the corridors, passengers avoiding his gaze or whispering in hushed tones. The bikers' defeat hadn't gone unnoticed, and it seemed word of the confrontation on the deck had spread quickly. Vince and his men were conspicuously absent, which only deepened Jason's sense of foreboding. Jason knew better than to let his guard down. Vince wasn't the type to admit defeat, and his silence was a clear indication that he was planning something bigger. As Jason reached the dining area, he found the Wilsons seated at their usual table near the windows. George waved him over, his expression lined with worry. "Morning, Jason. Any trouble last night?" Jason replied, sitting down across from them. But it's not over. Vince is planning something. I can feel it. Eileen's hand trembled as she sipped her tea. Why can't they just leave us alone? We haven't done anything to them. Jason leaned forward, his tone calm but firm. Because people like them thrive on fear. When someone stands up to them, it threatens their control. That's why they won't stop. George frowned. So what do we do? Jason gave them a reassuring look. Stick together, stay visible, and trust me, I'll handle it. The day passed uneventfully, but Jason's instincts told him it was the calm before the storm. As the sun set and the ship's evening activities began, Jason made his way to the upper decks, keeping a watchful eye on the crowd. The bikers had to be somewhere, and he intended to find them before they caused more harm. He didn't have to wait long. Near one of the ship's smaller lounges, Jason spotted two of Vince's men lingering by the entrance, their eyes scanning the crowd. Their postures were tense, their movements purposeful. Jason blended into the flow of passengers, watching as they spoke quietly to each other before disappearing inside. Jason followed at a distance, careful not to draw attention to himself. The lounge was dimly lit, with only a few scattered patrons sitting at tables. Near the back, Jason spotted Vince and his men huddled around a table, their expressions grim. He moved closer, slipping into a shadowed corner where he could hear fragments of their conversation. We can't let him get away with this, Vince growled, his voice low but filled with anger. The crew's already on our case because of him. If we don't put him in his place, we lose everything. One of his men nodded. What about the old couple? They're the reason he got involved in the first place. We make an example out of them, he'll back off. Jason's fists clenched at the suggestion, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to blow his cover. Not yet. Vince leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile spreading across his face. The Wilsons, it is. Jason slipped away before the conversation ended, his mind racing. Vince's plan wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming control. If they went after the Wilsons, it wouldn't just be a scare tactic. It would be a message to everyone aboard the ship. He couldn't let that happen. Jason quickly made his way to the Wilsons' cabin, knocking urgently on the door. George opened it, his face lighting up with relief. Jason, what is it? They're coming for you, Jason said bluntly, stepping inside. Vince's men are planning to target you tonight. Eileen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. What do we do? Jason's mind was already working through the possibilities. We're going to move you somewhere safe, somewhere they won't think to look. With the Wilsons in tow, Jason led them to a crew-only section of the ship. Thanks to the crew member who had helped him before, Jason had access to a small storage room near the engine deck. It wasn't luxurious, but it was out of the way and secure. You'll be safe here, Jason assured them as he locked the door. I'll handle the rest. Eileen grabbed his arm, her eyes filled with worry. Jason, please, don't do anything reckless. Jason gave her a small smile. Reckless isn't my style. With the Wilsons secured, Jason returned to the main decks, his focus sharpening. He knew Vince wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, and the time had come to put an end to it. As Jason made his way toward the lounge, he couldn't help but feel a surge of resolve. Vince and his gang had pushed too far. Now it was Jason's turn. Jason moved with purpose as he approached the lounge where Vince and his men had been earlier. The ship's corridors were quieter now, the late hour thinning the crowds. The atmosphere was heavy, as though the ship itself anticipated the conflict brewing beneath its polished surface. Jason's mind raced as he thought about Vince's plan to target the Wilsons. This wasn't just personal anymore. The bikers had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored, but Jason also knew there was a larger game at play. The smuggling operation Vince had orchestrated couldn't be left unchecked. As he neared the lounge, Jason noticed two of Vince's men stationed outside, their expressions alert. They weren't being subtle anymore. This was intimidation in its rawest form. Jason's lips pressed into a thin line as he assessed the situation. A direct confrontation here would draw too much attention, and Vince's men weren't his only target. Jason slipped away, navigating through the ship's dimly lit service corridors. He retraced his steps to the storage area he'd discovered earlier, where the bikers had stashed their contraband. The lock was new, hastily installed, but Jason had anticipated this. He retrieved his toolkit and quickly picked the lock, slipping inside with practiced silence. The storage room was as he'd left it, but now the contraband had been reorganized, suggesting the bikers were preparing for a handoff. Jason unzipped one of the duffel bags, revealing the same tightly wrapped packages of drugs he'd seen before. He moved to another bag and uncovered handguns, ammunition, and even more illicit goods. As he inspected the room, his eyes landed on something new, a ledger tucked under a crate. Jason opened it, scanning the entries. Names, numbers, and dates filled the pages, detailing the bikers' operation. Each port they'd stopped at had a corresponding entry, and the next one, scheduled for tomorrow, was marked with a bold red circle. Jason's suspicions were confirmed. Vince and his gang weren't just smuggling for profit. They were part of a larger network. The cruise ship was a perfect cover for transporting contraband, with thousands of passengers masking their activities. Jason snapped photos of the ledger and the contents of the duffel bags, ensuring he had evidence to turn over to authorities. But as he worked, he heard footsteps approaching the storage room. He slipped into the shadows, his body tense as the door creaked open. Vince and one of his men entered, their voices low but angry. "I don't care what it takes," Vince growled. "We're finishing this. That Marine has been a thorn in my side since day one." His companion hesitated. "What about the drop tomorrow? We can't afford any more delays." Vince slammed his fist against a crate. "I don't care. We deal with him tonight, and we finish the job in the morning. No one screws with me and gets away with it." Jason stayed perfectly still as the men inspected the room, their eyes scanning for signs of tampering. When they left, Jason exhaled quietly, his mind racing. Vince's timeline was clear. The bikers planned to eliminate him tonight and complete their smuggling operation at the next port. Jason returned to the main decks, his focus narrowing. He approached the crew member who had helped him earlier, explaining what he'd found. "Get this to the captain," Jason instructed, handing over the photos and the details of the ledger. "He needs to alert the authorities at the next port. They'll have enough evidence to make arrests." The crew member nodded, his face pale but resolute. "What about you?" Jason's jaw tightened. "I'll take care of Vince." As the crew member disappeared into the corridors, Jason made his way to the upper deck, where he knew Vince would come looking for him. The night was cool, the sound of the waves a constant rhythm against the ship. Jason stood by the railing, his posture relaxed but his senses sharp. It didn't take long. Vince and his men emerged from the shadows, their expressions cold and calculating. Vince held a crowbar in one hand, his smirk filled with malice. "You should have stayed out of it, Marine," Vince said, his voice dripping with venom. "Now you're going overboard." Jason turned slowly, his eyes meeting Vince's without a hint of fear. "You should have picked someone else to mess with." Vince's smirk faltered for a moment, but he recovered quickly. Gesturing to his men, the first man lunged, and Jason moved like a coiled spring, his training taking over. He disarmed the attacker with a sharp twist of his wrist, sending the weapon clattering to the deck. A quick elbow to the ribs and a knee strike left the man gasping on the ground. The second man swung wildly, but Jason sidestepped the attack and used the man's momentum to throw him into the railing. The sound of his groan echoed into the night as he slumped to the ground. Vince's smirk was gone, replaced by a snarl of rage. He charged at Jason with the crowbar, swinging with brutal force. Jason ducked, grabbing Vince's arm and twisting it behind his back. The crowbar fell to the deck with a metallic clang. "You're done," Jason said, his voice cold. Vince struggled, but Jason's grip was unrelenting. Security arrived moments later, summoned by the crew member Jason had spoken to. Vince and his men were quickly subdued, their reign of terror on the ship finally over. As the bikers were escorted away, the captain approached Jason, his expression one of gratitude. "You've done more than anyone could have asked," he said. "We'll turn them over to the authorities at the next port. You've saved a lot of people tonight." Jason nodded, his demeanor calm, just doing what needed to be done. But as he walked away, he allowed himself a small smile. The fight was over, but the lesson was clear. You don't mess with a Marine. The ship's midnight gala was in full swing. Guests dressed in their finest attire mingled on the upper decks, the sound of live jazz blending with the murmur of conversation and the occasional clink of glasses. Jason moved quietly through the crowd, his sharp eyes scanning for any sign of Vince or his remaining men. He knew the bikers wouldn't go quietly, not after what had happened in the storage room. Jason wasn't looking for trouble, but he knew trouble was looking for him. The night's calm shattered when Vince appeared at the top of the grand staircase, his face twisted with rage. His gang followed close behind, their leather vests and rough demeanor clashing with the formal atmosphere of the gala. The crowd fell silent, the music screeching to a halt as passengers turned to stare at the unexpected intrusion. Jason stepped forward, positioning himself between the bikers and the other guests. His posture was calm, but his muscles were coiled, ready for the inevitable. Vince pointed at Jason, his voice booming across the deck. "You think you've won? You don't know who you're dealing with." Jason met his gaze unflinching. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A bunch of bullies who don't know when to quit." Vince snarled and gestured to his men. The first man rushed at Jason, a knife glinting in his hand. Jason sidestepped the attack with precision, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it until the knife clattered to the ground. With a swift strike to the jaw, Jason sent him sprawling. 2 more bikers charged next, their movements clumsy in comparison to Jason's disciplined grace. Jason ducked a wild punch, delivering a sharp elbow to one attacker's ribs before sweeping the other's legs out from under him. Both men hit the deck hard, groaning in pain. The crowd gasped, a few guests even cheering as Jason methodically took down each opponent. Vince's face turned red with fury as he watched his men fall one by one. Vince stepped forward, pulling a small handgun from his waistband. The crowd recoiled in fear, screams rippling through the deck. Jason's eyes narrowed, his focus zeroing in on the weapon. "You're not walking away from this," Vince growled, leveling the gun at Jason. Jason raised his hand slowly, his expression calm despite the danger. "Think about what you're doing, Vince. There's nowhere to run. The authorities are waiting at the next port." "I don't care about the cops," Vince shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is about respect." Jason took a slow step forward, his voice steady. "Respect isn't something you take, Vince. It's something you earn, and pulling a gun on unarmed people isn't going to get you any." Vince's hand wavered slightly, the weight of the situation beginning to sink in, but before he could react, Jason made his move. In a flash, he closed the distance between them, grabbing Vince's wrist and forcing the gun upward. The weapon discharged harmlessly into the air, the deafening sound silencing the deck once more. Jason twisted Vince's arm, the gun falling to the ground with a metallic clatter. Vince howled in pain as Jason disarmed him, shoving him back against the railing. The gang leader slumped, defeated, as security officers swarmed onto the deck, quickly restraining him and the remaining bikers. As Vince and his men were led away in handcuffs, the passengers erupted into applause. The tension that had gripped the gala dissipated, replaced by admiration for the man who had stood his ground. The ship's captain approached Jason, his expression one of deep gratitude. "Once again, you've saved us all. I can't thank you enough." Jason shook his head. "Just doing what needed to be done." The captain smiled. "I'll make sure the authorities know exactly who made this possible. You're a hero, Mr. Hayes." Jason's expression softened, but he said nothing. He wasn't looking for praise, just peace. As the crowd began to disperse, Jason found the Wilsons standing near the railing, their faces filled with relief. Eileen stepped forward, wrapping her arms around Jason in a warm hug. "You've done more for us than we could ever repay." George nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "You stood up for everyone on this ship. Thank you, son." Jason gave them a small smile. "You two just enjoy the rest of your trip. The hard part's over." As he watched the couple walk away, Jason leaned against the railing, staring out at the dark expanse of the ocean. The fight was over, and the ship was safe again. But as he let the cool sea breeze wash over him, Jason couldn't help but reflect on the events of the past few days. No matter how far he tried to distance himself from his past, the instincts of a Marine never left him. He wasn't just a man on vacation. He was a protector, a fighter, and someone who couldn't stand by when others were in danger. And in the quiet of the night, with the stars shining above, Jason realized that was something he could live with.